AKAI EWI USB Deep Dive. If you've watched some of my previous videos, you may have noticed me occasionally playing this odd thing. If you already know what it is, this video may not be for you. I confess, I'm somewhat of a dilettante, but I feel like I've spent enough time with it that I want to talk about my experiences. This is an AKAI EWI electronic wind instrument. Specifically, it's the now discontinued EWI USB. There have been several models of the EWI over the years, but this one has a significant distinction. Besides being cheaper than any of the others, which is why I chose it, it's also strictly a MIDI controller. There are no onboard sounds, no speaker, no audio output. It has to be plugged via a USB cable into a computer running digital audio workstation software in order to produce any sound. The lack of built-in sounds isn't as limiting as it might seem. You can easily play it live, running something like Mainstage. Hang on, I should clarify what I mean by easily. I mean it's easy to set up, but playing the EWI itself is not exactly easy, as I'll explain in a moment. AKAI distributes computer software for the EWI USB, or any EWI really, that includes all of the standard EWI sounds, and that fully responds to all of the EWI's inputs, some of which are apparently proprietary, not MIDI. Those standard sounds include a huge range of sampled acoustic instruments, from common ones like flute and French horn, to more obscure ones like alto flute and English horn, plus some classic synth patches. The software also lets you combine multiple patches for a unique ensemble sound, with options to adjust the volume, stereo balance, pitch shift, etc. In theory, it's all great. In practice, well, let's just say it has some limitations. And although the AKAI EWI was the first semi-commercially successful wind controller, these days it has some pretty stiff competition from Roland and Yamaha. I'll be honest, I've never tried the competition. I had a specific reason to choose an EWI, which I'll get to. I think if I tried something like a Roland Aerophone now, I'd just be mad at myself for ever wasting my time and money on this. But since I already have the EWI, I'm determined to make it work for my purposes. Any questions? What exactly are my purposes? What are the pros and cons of the AKAI EWI, and how did it come to exist in the first place? These are the questions I'll answer in this video, in reverse order. Before that, just the standard plug to please like and subscribe. As I record this, I'm at 980 subscribers, tantalizingly close to the magic 1,000 subscriber threshold, where all sorts of wonderful things supposedly happen. I've also finally finished setting up the Patreon account I've had for several years, so if you'd like to support the random stuff I do on this channel, you'll find a link in the description below. Okay, let's talk EWI. And although I'm specifically talking about my EWI USB, most of what I have to say here applies to all the models. How did the EWI come to exist? I first learned about the EWI when I started listening to Michael Brecker at the suggestion of my high school band director around 1989. Michael Brecker is mainly known for playing tenor saxophone, but rather than doubling on soprano sax like his influences John Coltrane and Wayne Shorter, he took things in a more high-tech direction, like another influence, Eddie Harris. Brecker appeared on the jazz scene in 1969, alongside his trumpet-playing brother Randy, on Randy's debut album, Score. Then they both played in the short-lived Chicago-esque jazz rock band, Dreams. Then the two set out together as the Brecker Brothers. They were also highly in-demand session musicians throughout the 1970s and beyond. Both Michael and Randy experimented extensively in supplementing their sounds with electronics. Randy connected a contact microphone to his trumpet and ran it through wah-wah and delay pedals. And Michael, much like fellow saxophonist Benny Maupin, was heavily involved from the early days of the development of dedicated electronic wind instruments based on the saxophone. Benny Maupin played an early wind synth called the Lyricon, but Michael Brecker gravitated to Niall Steiner's EWI, playing several early prototype models and helping provide feedback on the instrument's evolution. In the 1970s, Niall Steiner developed a wind synth controller called the Electronic Valve Instrument, or EV, based on brass instrument fingerings. Then he created the EWI based on woodwind fingerings. Steiner partnered with the Japanese audio tech company AKAI for mass production, and eventually he sold the rights to the designs and the brand itself to AKAI. Earlier EWI models consisted of both the controller device and a separate synthesizer head unit, but modern EWIs, except the USB, now contain the software within the controller itself. All modern EWIs can also connect to external computer software. AKAI's original business collapsed in the late 1990s, and the modern AKAI brand is owned by a Hong Kong-based holding company. Musical gear companies owned by dispassionate investor groups who don't really understand or care about their products seems to be a trend in the 21st century. Keep that thought in mind as we proceed. What are the pros and cons of the EWI? The EWI is weird. Many of the pros and cons are readily apparent as you learn about how it's designed. First off, holding it feels a lot like holding a clarinet or a soprano saxophone, and the key system closely matches the keys of a saxophone, so it's easy for a woodwind player to understand. It's configurable to use a few different fingering systems based on the saxophone, flute, and oboe. Plus, it has its own custom EWI and EV fingering systems. Although my EWI USB arrived configured to saxophone fingerings, at some point I accidentally activated the EWI fingering mode and I've never been able to switch it back, probably because I can't run the AKAI software on my Mac. The key system on the front will be familiar to any saxophone or clarinet player. We have a series of circular keys down the middle for the main diatonic notes of the instrument. Additional keys on the sides allow for playing accidentals, along with groupings of pinky finger keys that extend the range of the instrument. All of the familiar quirks are here, such as using your left middle finger for C or your right middle finger for F sharp. It even has both a bis key and a side key for B flat. The pinky keys do exactly what you'd expect. That is, unless you switch to EWI fingering mode. Looking at the fingering charts, EWI mode and saxophone mode seem almost identical, and fortunately they are. Enough so that I can continue to play the EWI and just pretend I'm in saxophone fingerings. But there's a distinct difference in EWI mode that is not reflected in the fingering chart. The side pinky keys will actually shift any note you're playing up or down by a half step. In saxophone mode, if I recall correctly, those keys have no effect except when you're on the specific notes those keys play on a real saxophone. This extra feature might just seem like a nice bonus, except it's way too easy to trigger those keys accidentally. Hold that thought, I'll come back to it. On the back side of most woodwind instruments, your thumbs don't really have much to do besides holding it. The EWI keeps your thumbs busy with some extra responsibilities. The left thumb, which on a saxophone just has one octave key to deal with, now has a system of rollers, giving you easy access to a huge 5-octave range. The right thumb, meanwhile, sits on a small metal plate between two other angled plates. You have to be touching that middle plate for the instrument to work. I'm not really sure why, grounding or something. Rocking your right thumb up or down onto those raised sections triggers a pitch bend effect. So those are the basics. If you know how to play a saxophone, you can, theoretically, just pick up an EWI and start playing it. And that was true for me. But not entirely. The major differences in playing EWI versus traditional woodwinds. The keys on an EWI don't move. That in itself doesn't take too much getting used to, but check this out. The keys are capacitive switches. In other words, they're touch sensitive. If your fingers are touching a key at all, it registers as a press. Watch closely when someone like Michael Brecker is playing an EWI, and you'll notice that their fingers are always hovering in the air above the key. That's not just a personal choice or sloppy technique. You have to do that. It's designed that way. Saxophone teachers encourage their students to keep their fingers resting directly on the keys. It helps anchor them in place, and it also makes it easier to play fast passages because you're minimizing travel, but you can't do that on an EWI. Getting used to the idea of not touching the keys is easy. Actually doing it is another. I personally find that my main issue with the EWI is that I sometimes accidentally brush my fingers against the side keys without even noticing it. The EWI is absolutely unforgiving. Of course, with a wind instrument, your fingers only do half the job. The rest is done with your mouth. Yes, the EWI has a mouthpiece that you blow into. MIDI supports breath control, so in addition to your breath triggering the attack and release on notes, you can also affect the volume by how hard you blow. The EWI mouthpiece is odd. It's silicone, with two small holes in it to allow air to pass through. There's also a small opening at the bottom of the EWI where condensation drips out, so apparently there's a tube all the way through the body that you're blowing through. It may seem unnecessary, but that condensation has to collect somewhere. Running it through the length of the instrument keeps it from dripping down the sides onto your hands. But you're basically blowing into a drinking straw. The small holes in the mouthpiece don't allow nearly as much air to pass through as a real woodwind instrument, so you'll often find yourself with too much air in your lungs. This sometimes happens on a real saxophone or clarinet, forcing you to find a way to exhale that extra air other than blowing it through the instrument, but I find it way more common on the EWI. I suspect that if I played the EWI more, I'd learn to adapt, but it really feels awkward. I think either condensation or excess breath might explain why Michael Brecker always had a brightly colored sweatband wrapped around the top of his EWIs just below the mouthpiece. I imagine with how intensely he played, there was a lot of moisture to absorb. The silicone is bite sensitive for pitch bend effects and vibrato, in addition to the sensors on the right thumb. Again, in theory it's great, but in practice it works nothing like the way you lip notes up or down on a saxophone, so it's of limited use. I also just find it feels really unpleasant. Plus, there are some software issues which I'll get to more in the next section. Our list of pros and cons is starting to take shape. Pro: the fingerings are intuitive and easy to learn for existing woodwind players. Con: the touch-sensitive keys can be hard to get used to, and accidental key presses are a common occurrence. Pro: customizable fingering systems make this an easy second instrument for players of various woodwinds. Con: the custom EWI fingering scheme is clever but pointless. No one is learning on this as a primary instrument. Pro: breath control makes it possible to manipulate the sound. Con: but not always in ways that seem realistic compared to an acoustic woodwind instrument. That covers the hardware side, but there are pros and cons to talk about with the software as well. Software is just as important as hardware. As any iPad user knows, no matter how cool the hardware might be, an electronic device is only as useful as its software. I'm not going to dance around this. AKAI's software situation for the EWI sucks. I'm not saying the samples suck. They're okay. They were great, relatively speaking, 30 years ago. But they haven't kept up with modern developments in sampling technology, and they sound extremely dated, even just compared to the built-in software instruments in Logic 11. You notice how dated the sounds are when you try to apply things like pitch bend or especially vibrato. It just doesn't sound realistic at all, to the point where, in my opinion, it ruins the EWI as a viable option for doubling in situations like a pit orchestra. Beyond the quality of the sounds, there's the software itself. AKAI makes a lot of things like keyboards, drum machines, and of course the EWI that are designed to connect to computer software. In some cases, like my EWI USB, they have to connect to computer software to be usable. And AKAI is notoriously lax when it comes to supporting this software and keeping it compatible with OS updates. I mean, it's really bad. As good as a lot of AKAI's hardware is, they destroy much of that value by virtually abandoning the software as soon as it's released. Here I have to go off on a bit of a tangent, and this is not exclusively about AKAI. It's the same reason I switched from Pro Tools to GarageBand, yes, GarageBand, in 2006. I bought a new MacBook Pro with an M4 Pro chip back in November. Before that, I was running an M1 Pro. I did have the AKAI software installed on my previous Mac, but I never bothered to try installing it on this one, since I had already mostly abandoned using the EWI sound patches. For the purposes of this video, I decided to finally install the AKAI software. Except, I can't. macOS 15 Sequoia, which this Mac ships with and can't downgrade, not that I'd want to, has additional security measures that make it harder to install unsigned software, which includes AKAI's creaky old EWI software. But that just means some extra hoops to jump through. Normally, that's all, but in this case, no luck. The AKAI software absolutely will not install on this computer. I understand why a lot of audio software breaks when there's a new OS release. Ever since MIDI was introduced in the 1980s, companies that make MIDI gear have always had to bend the OS rules to get their gear talking to the computer. But that hasn't really been a necessity for about 20 years, at least on the Mac side. Apple provides standard APIs within macOS for MIDI gear that will just continue to work automatically whenever there's an OS update. Unfortunately, music gear companies neglect their software. Instead of rewriting it to take advantage of these new APIs, they just keep patching their legacy code forever, always playing catch up with things that break in every OS update, until eventually they just give up and abandon it altogether. Software-wise, the EWI USB is abandoned. Sure, the hardware is also discontinued, but it was discontinued less than 3 years ago. Surely people who spend several $100s on a device like this expect to be able to play it for more than a few months. Fortunately, the EWI USB works as a general MIDI controller, so you don't have to use AKAI's software. It's plug and play with built-in software instruments in Logic. I don't have any AKAI software installed on this Mac, and I'm still using the EWI with it. But some things are missing. Logic seems to recognize the standard inputs without any issue, but it mostly treats the EWI like a keyboard. It does support both attack volume and aftertouch via breath control, plus pitch bend with either the right thumb plates or bite control. If we're pretending this is a keyboard, It would be nice if the byte control worked like a mod wheel instead of a redundant up-only pitch bend. But, well, maybe I can figure out how to program that at some point. Honestly, this is where my knowledge breaks down a little, partly because the interfaces are confusing, and partly because I generally am not interested in mucking around with configuration. I just want to start playing. And you can just start playing, if you're okay with these limitations. Practically speaking, the main problem I find is that the MIDI-based tracks I record in Logic tend to misread note attacks. Especially when I'm tonguing notes and playing staccato, there are a lot of false attacks that get recorded. So I end up having to edit the MIDI notes in the piano roll in Logic and join together all of the separate notes that were really supposed to just be one. It sounds tedious, and I'm not gonna lie, it is. But it's not as tedious as it could be. There's probably a way to fix this if I were only to take the time to dive into the configuration, but I already said I don't have the patience for that. Tedious note joining though, apparently I can do that all day. Another related issue is with quantizing the MIDI tracks. I don't like over-quantizing things to the point of sounding robotic, but ultimately it's just another tool, and it helps tighten up tracks without having to re-record. It's especially useful on the EWI, which doesn't always respond the way I expect it to when I'm playing. The problem is, quantizing only shifts the notes themselves. It doesn't shift the timing of the associated breath control data, so you sometimes get weird attacks and releases as a result. This is really a Logic thing, not an EWI thing, and there may be a way around it I just haven't found yet. Back to the pros and cons list. Pro. The EWI software includes a huge range of sampled instruments, including some fairly obscure ones. Con. But the samples are dated and lack a lot of the expression capabilities of modern sampling software. Pro. The EWI works reasonably well as a general MIDI controller, so you don't have to use AKAI's software, because, con, AKAI's software is mediocre to begin with, and it isn't updated to run on newer computers. Don't just take my word for it. It's time to hear what the EWI can do, or more accurately, what I can do with the EWI. And even more accurately, what I can do with the EWI and Logic's sound library, since I can't use the EWI sound library with this Mac. What is the essence of EWI? If the EWI USB is just a MIDI controller, and I'm not using the official EWI software, am I even really playing the EWI at all? Well, there are two aspects to playing any musical instrument: what it sounds like and how it feels to play. Any synth can sound like, well, just about anything. If I'm using Logic sounds, what's the difference between me using my EWI or just plugging a regular keyboard into it? That's where the feel part comes in. The easiest way to think about it is polyphony. You can press down multiple keys on a keyboard and you get a chord. You can't do that on a saxophone, and you can't do it on an EWI. Well, okay, skilled saxophonists and 5th graders can deliberately overblow and create polyphony via overtones. The human voice can do that too. As for the EWI, it can play chords if the synth patch you're using has a harmonizer or chord effect applied to it. It's something I use in some of the demo tracks. What I'm getting at here is, simply put, The way an instrument is played affects what you play on the instrument. The more a player learns the nuances of an instrument, both its strengths and weaknesses, the more that player can lean into the positive characteristics and avoid the negative ones. And that shapes what you do with the instrument. With the EWI, my biggest challenges are cleanly navigating octave jumps and tonguing articulation. For octaves, I mostly just avoid phrases that have to bridge the gap. I stay in one octave, C to C, or I jump a full octave on the note I'm already playing. Or I break up the phrase so I can cleanly reset my fingers. For tonguing, well, this is a big difference between EWI and acoustic woodwinds. Standard woodwind technique is to tongue every note unless intentionally slurring, and always tongue the first note of a phrase. On EWI, at least when capturing MIDI data, such as with the EWI USB, tonguing often creates extra note events that you didn't mean to play, especially at the end of notes. So I generally have to go in and edit the MIDI timeline, as I mentioned before. But I've learned that probably ideally on EWI, you wouldn't tongue notes at all. Just starting and stopping your breath creates the attack and release, and each new note you play as you're blowing through a phrase is a separate attack. But I struggle to articulate fast notes without tonguing because that's just what I'm used to. I suspect this might be less of an issue with the proprietary EWI software, which I think handles the input in a way that doesn't strictly adhere to MIDI standards. At the very least, it probably handles slurs and stop tonguing better than Logic's default MIDI input does. I can sense you're getting bored with this though, so let's move on, shall we? How do I use the EWI? This all brings me back to the first of the questions I rattled off earlier in this video. What are my intentions with the EWI? Why did I get one? How do I use it? And do I wish I had gotten something else instead? I bought the EWI mainly as a curiosity and because Michael Brecker played one. Honestly, I was never a huge fan of the sounds Michael Brecker produced with it, although I eventually realized a lot of the time he was just using a sample of a trumpet with a Harmon mute. Maybe he missed the color Randy brought to their collaborative work. I saw the EWI mainly as a way for me to supplement my own music recordings. I never intended to use it for live performance. I have two specific reasons why I wanted the EWI for recording. First, I wanted the flexibility to play a wide variety of sounds with an interface that is familiar and intuitive to me. Sure, I've gotten reasonably good at my own idiosyncratic way of playing keyboards, but with no formal training, besides the piano proficiency aspect of my college music theory classes, I've basically never developed the ability to read music while I'm playing keyboard. I just have to memorize whatever I'm going to play. Side note, yes, music students, learning by ear and memorization are useful skills, and definitely something you should work on. But for a busy 50-year-old who isn't a full-time musician, being able to just sit down and sight read something is even more useful. It's not that I lack the music theory knowledge or don't know the notes on the keyboard. I'm actually really good with those things. Ask me to play a B-flat 7 sharp 9 chord on a piano, and I know the notes are B-flat, D, F, A-flat, and D-flat, and I can locate them without hesitation. I just can't do it without looking. I can't look at sheet music, then down at my hands, and then back up to the music fast enough to keep up. Plus, having never studied a polyphonic instrument, I didn't develop the ability to read sheet music vertically. Piano players learn to recognize the shapes of chords as quickly as we recognize words on a page. Us punks who only ever studied a monophonic instrument, like clarinet or saxophone, are essentially just reading one letter at a time. The point of that digression was just that I thought using the EWI would give me the ability to play more complex written passages and improvise solos as easily as I can on a saxophone, but with the huge range of sounds available through MIDI. The second reason I wanted an EWI was a bit more practical. My kids are both in college now, but at the time I got the EWI, they were in high school. Anyone who has kids that age, or remembers being that age themselves, will remember that weekends generally mean sleeping in until the early afternoon. But weekend mornings are often my best time for recording. It was just not viable for me to decide to start wailing on an alto saxophone at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. But I can play the EWI down here in my dungeon whenever I want without disturbing anyone. Unfortunately, even though I've used the EWI quite a bit by this point, it isn't really useful for me in any context other than these home recording sessions, which are too infrequent to really overcome the awkwardness of the EWI's touch controls and weird mouthpiece design. I can play it, but it doesn't come nearly as naturally to me as picking up a clarinet or saxophone. Conclusion. Now that you know why I have an EWI, would I recommend it to anyone else in the same situation? Honestly, no, I wouldn't. The only reason I would recommend an EWI is if you want to be like Michael Brecker, which, sure, I get it. That's as valid a reason as any. After all, that's why I chose the EWI over other options. But those other options have improved a lot in the past few years, particularly after I got my EWI. Okay, that Brecker thing was a bit glib, but what I really meant by it is, the EWI has the history. Capacitive touch controls are not the optimal design for an instrument like this in 2025, but they connect you to the unique legacy of this instrument going back over half a century. It's even older than I am. If you want to understand and feel connected to the history of electronic wind instruments, get yourself a real electronic wind instrument, which is to say, the EWI. But if you want something that's going to be easy to pick up and play, I can honestly say, without ever even having tried any of the competition, that this is almost certainly not the best option out there. The Roland Aerophones seem to be the most highly regarded EWI-style instruments right now. The fact that they have mechanical keys is probably reason enough to recommend them over an EWI. I don't know what their software is like, but, well, it can't possibly be any worse than the situation with AKAI. In fact, I think I may have just convinced myself I need an Aerophone. Stay tuned. For now, here's the best I can muster with the EWI. Everything you're about to hear is played on the EWI except the drums. I tried, but quickly realized how poorly suited the EWI's input is for programming beats. The horn parts are using Logic's Studio Horn patches, which have their own built-in expression effects. The EWI does control the attack, release, and volume, but everything else is happening automatically. That's one of the downsides of using Logic sounds instead of the custom EWI software, but it's what I have available to me at the moment. Okay, let's check it out. Outro song. Human voice can do that.